9, 12, 10, 28, 2, 23.
This is the DSR Podcast. Hello and welcome to a special emergency edition of DSR. I'm David Rothkopf, your host. We're joined today by three of our smartest and coolest-headed friends, including General Doug Lute, former U.S. ambassador to NATO, which, that's the job, may not exist in the future. How are you doing, Doug?
I'm doing well. Thank you.
Excellent. Also, our friend Marc Polymeropoulos, who, as everybody knows, long career with the Central Intelligence Agency and spent a lot of time thinking about Ukraine. How are you doing, Marc?
Not a good day today. Got to admit.
Not a good day. And of course, Rosa Brooks of Georgetown University Law Center. How are you today, Rosa?
I'm reduced to making inarticulate, strangled, moaning noises like,
Well, we'll count on you. And if anybody hears those during the podcast,
that will be my contribution to this conversation.
That's Rosa making animal noises in the background. But let's start. Of course, the reason we're doing this special podcast is because this afternoon there was a meeting at the White House between the President of the United States, the Vice President of the United States, and the President of Ukraine. It resulted in, that was Rosa, it resulted in absolutely extraordinary display, the likes of which I have never seen, open sort of fighting amongst them all on television. But I think even more shocking than the display are the consequences of the display, what it really means for where the United States is vis-a-vis Ukraine, vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis our allies in Europe. And I thought it was important to get a take on that from these different perspectives. Let's start with you, Doug. Did you watch?
So I didn't watch it live, but I watched the clips. And I will tell you, so I was in the White House for 6 years, working on Iraq and Afghanistan under first President Bush and then President Obama, and was in meetings like the one clipped today, dozens of times, with international leaders who represented countries in severe stress. So think the dark days in Iraq. So Iraq's burning 06, 07, and Bush surges into Iraq. Iraqi leaders would come in. Or think Karzai or Ghani from Afghanistan. So countries which fundamentally were staking their future on their partnership with the United States and with the president seated there in front of the fireplace. And I never could imagine, much less witness, anything like this display today. Look, if there are difficult conversations to be had, they could be held in the Oval Office, but not in front of 20 or 30 reporters and television cameras. And there have been difficult conversations in that setting, but not on public display. And I think, candidly, deliberately on public display in a way that is fundamentally against not only the protocols of the presidency and the Oval Office, but just the common sense tenets of diplomacy. You don't conduct that kind of serious conversation in front of television cameras.
Well, let me follow
up with the conclusion that it was deliberate.
Yeah, well, that's what I want to follow up on. Just elaborate on that a moment more. Why do you think it was deliberate?
Well, first of all, because of the way the conversation rolled out, right? And I think that, frankly, the vice president's role here was important because he's the one who sort of, in the midst of a conversation about the supposed deal on critical minerals and so forth, I think I found the vice president's comments to Zelensky as provoking, claiming that he had been ungrateful. And I think quite candidly, that was red meat for the president. I mean, once Zelensky used, you should be grateful, and Zelensky said, "I have been." Well, that was the line that the president then picked up on, and then frankly, it spiraled downwards after that.
Yeah, but just so that we're clear on this, Zelensky began the meeting by thanking the president.
Right.
He's thanked the president many times, contrary to what J.D. Vance said. But I tend to agree with your assessment that a lot of what we saw today was deliberate. Mark, what was your reaction?
So I thought it was reprehensible behavior by the president and the vice president. There's no way around that. We are insulting an ally. We're insulting an ally that has gone through extraordinary pain and suffering. And I just kept asking myself, what for? Who wins in this? Well, clearly, SVR chairman Sergei Naryshkin is celebrating in Moscow because this is absolutely exactly what the Kremlin ultimately wants. But is this to satisfy somehow the base? I mean, I don't know, but the damage is incalculable. What is happening? My phone blew up from friends in Europe, from think tanks in Europe, from former intel officials I knew, and they were just incredulous. And a lot of it has to do exactly what I think, David, you're trying to set up here. What we saw was awful, but what does this mean? And it means is, this notion of America as the bright, shining city on the hill is no longer. I mean, we are an ally that can't be trusted. I was jotting notes down. This is from the head of a German think tank. U.S. is no longer an ally. I'm shocked and disgusted. And then they went on to say, I'm starting to drink. But it's the notion that, we used to be the good guys and we're not any longer. And the idea of partnerships, I think Doug mentioned this, partnerships in my old world and intelligence is absolutely critical. We do counterproliferation operations, counterterrorism operations. We work against Russia and China, counterintelligence operations. If we lose that, we lose a giant chunk of our national security strategy and America becomes less safe. And so I really think there's profound implications to this just atrocious Oval Awful meeting. And I tend to agree with Doug. I think it was staged. Especially J.D. Vance's behavior was just beyond the pale. I mean, it was, my wife said to me, she said, you don't even talk to a child like he did. You'd be sent to counseling. Just a bad day for America.
Yeah. Rosa, what do you think?
I absolutely think it was staged, at least in part, because of J.D. Vance's role. I mean, Trump, as we know, is perfectly capable of going bonkers in the middle of any normal conversation, including going bonkers in ways that his own aides are dismayed by. But I think Vance's comments made it pretty clear that Vance at least was planning precisely that conversation or some variant of it, which probably means that Trump was also doing so. It was horrifying to watch. I mean, it was mortifying. It was embarrassing. It was enraging. It was morally disgusting to watch. And you know what it really reminded me of? And Trump often reminds me of this, and Vance today did too. When I was working as a DC Reserve police officer, we did a zillion domestic violence calls. And spent a lot of time, talking about the dynamics of domestic violence and domestic abuse. And it felt like watching abuse, as you said, Zelensky starts out saying, I want to thank you so much. And then they're yelling at him. Vance is like, are you even going to say thank you? And you're like, what? It's this unbelievable level of gaslighting combined with bullying. It was bullying. It was gaslighting. I do think it was deliberate. I suppose that there are Trump voters who think, you sure showed him. I don't want to imagine what those people's home lives are like, because anybody who thinks that was an appealing bit of theater is got something seriously wrong with them. And I worry about their friends and family members who have to put up with them, frankly. So I think this goes back to a conversation that we had a couple days ago on this podcast, where I said, I think people are wrong when they say Trump is transactional. If you're transactional, you actually pay some attention to, okay, what did you just do for me? Now maybe I'll help you out. Or what can you do for me? And despite the rhetoric about are you going to make a deal or not? There was no actual negotiating. There was no actual recognition of, we are repeat players. We've been through some things together before. Let's talk about where we might go in the future. It was pure id, temper tantrum, muscle flexing. And I would go further than Mark, than you said. It's not just that the U.S. is not an ally anymore. My one tragic little contribution to the public discourse on X today consisted of saying the U.S. is now the enemy of the free world. I mean, we're not merely no longer an ally. I think today was the equivalent of a declaration of war on most of our allies, in a rhetorical sense. And as they deal with the economic warfare we're already launching, I suspect many of them are seeing it as non-metaphorical.
Yeah. Excellent point, and exactly where I wanted to take the conversation.
Well, you're welcome.
And I'm grateful for that. We saw on X and on Blue Sky and on others, Europeans step up and immediately say, it is clear today that the free world is without a leader. We need a leader. Europe must lead. So the broad, high-level official response to this is the United States is no longer the leader of the free world. I think that's true. But Doug, as we look at this, I've seen a number of analyses. And one set of analyses, all of them think they're being bold, right? One set says, we have switched sides in the conflict in Ukraine. Okay, that's one dimension of this. Others have said, we have switched sides with regard to our allies in Europe, and we're now opposed to them. Still others have said, we are now on Team Russia, that we are now actively on their side. And I think there's a lot of evidence, by the way, that supports that last point. Evidence that I don't know that most people are paying attention to. What we're seeing here is quite dramatic. But let me give you a couple points, Doug, before we get into it. One, there's a story that broke today. Hegseth orders Cyber Command to stand down on Russia planning. Okay? He ordered them to stop doing not just defense, offensive planning against Russia on cyber. We know that they stood down the part of the Department of Justice that was dealing with oligarchs and their abuses. We know that they stood down the part of the Department of Homeland Security that was dealing with Russian interference in our elections. We know that Trump said he'd like to have his gold cards bring Russian oligarchs here because he knows some very fine Russian oligarchs. We know that we've launched trade wars against our allies, that he has made more comments against NATO, that in Europe, J.D. Vance and Hegseth both said, we will no longer defend Europe. We know that Tulsi Gabbard, a Russia apologist, now runs the intelligence community. Hegseth is doing the same. And so I would argue that, in fact, across the board for the past 5 weeks leading up to today, every single action that this administration has taken has benefited Russia and hurt us and our allies. So it's a bigger thing than all of this. That's my perspective on it, but I want to know what yours is, Doug.
Well, I can't refute any one of the data points you just listed. I mean, and the pattern here, if there's a discernible pattern in what has been a chaotic 4 or 5 weeks, right? An unpredictable, chaotic whipsaw change from day to day administration, the one discernible pattern is the one you just outlined. And this is a significant reversal of course and alignment with Vladimir Putin's Russia. At the expense, as Mark highlighted, at the expense of fundamental security arrangements that have served us well for a long time. Now, that doesn't mean that any one of these elements of our security isn't ripe for reform and innovation and streamlining and efficiencies and so forth. But we're going after this with a chainsaw, and we're going to suffer from this. And the most significant, I think, strategic impact of this is that our European allies will no longer trust us. That will fundamentally fracture the NATO alliance, which has always been grounded on American commitment to collective defense. And Europe faces a very tough decision. which is, will they accumulate enough hard power, European hard power, to accompany their political cohesion and their economic power? And they've got to now do it on a crash basis because they can no longer count on us.
So, Mark, I'd love you to answer the question, but I want to add something into it that plays into your area. Is Five Eyes dead? If you were any of our allied intelligence services, would you share intel, not just with the intel community run by Tulsi Gabbard, but with the Trump administration that's now actively aligned with one of the principal targets of our intelligence? How does it survive that?
So, David, you know me, and I'll always give you a direct answer is no, they are not going to share with us. And I'll tell a couple things on that I think are important, just for listeners to understand. The Five Eyes Alliance is an intelligence sharing alliance, but there's the sharing of things such as human intelligence. That's from our agents and from our allied services agents. So that's human. That's the most sensitive, I would argue, as a former case officer. These are agents who put their lives in our hands to protect them, just like they do with the other services. And then there's the signals intelligence sharing relationship. That's intercepts of communications. In terms of Five Eyes, I think for example, our relationship with the British government, our systems are actually intertwined. They're interoperable. You can't break them. So there can't be a stoppage of sharing of signals intelligence. That just functionally can't happen. And our British counterparts have said this as well. But on the human intelligence side, it's going to start happening. I'm absolutely convinced, because again, you have a sacred bond with your agent if you're at the British Secret Intelligence Service, and you can't trust the United States. And so what's going to happen is they're going to stop. They're going to incrementally stop sharing. They're not going to tell us, because that would risk the wrath of Trump. But for example, the Brits are very good on Russia. I oversaw CIA's Russia House, and I had very strong contacts with our British counterparts. And we're going to see stuff dry up, and they're right. You can't argue with it, because you can't trust the United States with holding this with securing this information, because you have a president who is seemingly, and I'll use a loaded word, compromised in some sense, and you have a director of national intelligence who also seems to be very sympathetic to the Russians. So we will be less safe because of this. There's no doubt. And the story I wanted to tell you is I was at a conference a couple months ago in the UK, and I asked some former heads of services on the British side, and they were annoyed with me. So I raised this in kind of an open setting, and they said, no, we'd never stop sharing. And then over about 75 bottles of wine that night, when I was a case officer, I know what I'm doing, they admitted later on, they said, of course we'll stop sharing, because we have a sacred bond to the people who work for us in terms of the agents. And so it's going to happen. One quick point that David, on the list that you put forth in terms of things that seem to be sympathetic to the Russian side, I'd add the notion of increased Russian diplomatic presence in the United States, which this is what the Trump administration is going to agree to, ostensibly, with the Russians. That means more Russian intel officers here. Throw that on top of Kash Patel's stated goal to shrink counterintelligence squads, means the Russians are going to recruit more agents within the United States. And the last and the final point is this incredible own goal by the CIA in sending down the names of 2,500 of the probationary officers down to this weird OMB Elon Musk thing. We essentially compromised our entire junior officer cadre. It's been all over the press on this. And that means less officers who can then deploy to places like Moscow and Beijing. And so there's a lot more in what the administration is doing that has certainly hurt national security.
So, Rosa, one of the things I think about beyond, how the rest of our allies react to this in terms of intel is that it's got a strategic consequence. Do they think we'll defend them? Do they think our nuclear shield will be their nuclear shield? Should they develop their own nuclear shields? Will there be new countries entering into that world? Because I just think there are consequences. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are.
1728.
Yeah, I was thinking before answering that question, just going back to the earlier question, I would imagine that not only will our allies not Five Eyes not want to trust us with intelligence that they generate, but I would regard, if I were them, any intelligence we share with them with a pretty jaundiced eye at this point, because I doubt that they think that we're trustworthy in either direction at this stage. Which and it's of a piece with the eliminating essentially USAID, with cutting most of the State Department grant funded programs. I would be the last person to say everything USAID does is wonderful, or everything state does is wonderful. But these have always been conceptualized by the United States as tools of influence. They have sometimes been klutzy tools of influence. They've sometimes been ineffective tools of influence. But if the Trump administration doesn't understand or just doesn't care about essentially giving away all of the US soft power tools and sabotaging our own ability to get intelligence from our allies, that I think essentially means one of two things, right? And this goes to your question about what are the strategic implications of all of this, David. Either it means that they are so nihilistically fixated on looting the US government, and we got a couple billionaires and their friends are other billionaires, and they figure it doesn't really matter what happens to the planet Earth. We shall soon be, if we're not on our private island as everything else goes to hell with a private army defending us, we will be off to Mars or some, better place, because they just don't care if everything goes to hell. They figure that they are insulated. Now, I don't literally mean they go to Mars, although who the heck knows, in the further future, but that they regard themselves as, it's just a après-moi le deluge attitude, that they're not interested in global stability one way or the other. They don't care, because they think that they are the ultra rich and the friends of the ultra rich, and whatever level of global chaos happens, that they can somehow insulate themselves, which I think is mistaken, of course. I mean, I think one thing that we all know, and they should know too, is that unless they literally have a plan to go to Mars, and I don't think we're quite there yet, technologically speaking, that you can't insulate yourself from, say, global pandemic. You can't insulate yourself from climate change. You can't insulate yourself fully from potential nuclear catastrophe. So it's idiotic, but I think it is entirely possible that the Elon Musks of the world, and thus Donald Trump himself, genuinely just don't really care what happens to the globe, because they have the delusional notion that they somehow will be insulated from the consequences because they're so darn rich. The other possibility, which is equally sinister, is the one that Mark suggests, which is that this is the equivalent of, the Germans were the allies of the British at various points in the 19th century, and then they weren't anymore, and that this is just a cosmic reshuffling of global alliances, in which their actual intention, that this is not an accident. This is not sort of just because they're kind of klutzy, they're kind of becoming aligned with Putin, they're kind of becoming aligned with China because they didn't really think about it very much, and they're a bunch of idiots, which, you can never rule out that possibility of idiocy. But I don't think that's what we're seeing anymore. I do think that there is a real possibility that this is a deliberate realignment. We know that they're all about power, and that they have simply decided we're going to get richer and more powerful if we align with the bad guys. And we're perfectly happy to do that. And the thing that I find most stunning, frankly, is that the entire Republican Party appears perfectly contented to go right along with them.
Well, let me ask another question that's associated with this, Doug, because you come from a world in the military where people are trained to say yes, sir, and say, follow the orders, follow the legal orders of their superiors. And periodically in our history, we have switched sides. The Russians were our allies in World War II, and the day after World War II ended, they became our rivals and the biggest enemy that we thought of. Now, most of the people who are in the military have spent most of their career viewing Russia as a potential adversary, or worse, as an enemy. one of the things we've seen is a big change in DoD, not just Hegseth ordering, Cyber Command to stand down, but getting rid of people at the top of DoD in order to have a group that is aligned with Trump and Trumpian views, and presumably that includes this kind of thing. How does a switch of this degree go down in the Pentagon?
It's completely disorienting. So I spoke to a group of 40 or 50 newly minted one-star officers from across the services yesterday. And this is a several-week course that happens periodically. It's part of their professional development and so forth. And they face that cohort in particular, the up-and-coming next generation, faces a fundamental character check in terms of how seriously do they take their oath of office. And it's, by the way, it's the same oath of office that Mark and his colleagues and our foreign service officers and our development professionals take, right? Which is to the Constitution and not to some sort of loyalty check, commander in chief who's willy-nilly with the facts and so forth. So I think it's going to have these most recent dismissals of senior military officers, for which, look, can only be acknowledged as partisan politics based. I mean, there's nothing. Remember that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, C.Q. Brown, was made a 4-star general and put in charge of the Air Force under Donald Trump. Okay, and the only thing that's significant that happened since Trump put him in charge of the Air Force and today was that he made an impassioned statement to the Air Force about his experience as a young African American officer growing up after the Black Lives Matter thing. Right? I think that was the straw that broke the camel's back with C.Q. Brown. And look, this has a dramatic seismic effect in the ranks, because now officers who believed that they were doing their best, building the competence and the reputations to serve at higher ranks, I'll now have to add to that list. Am I willing to sacrifice my character? Am I willing to sacrifice my integrity? Am I willing to put partisan politics first? And God help us because there will be some who say yes and follow that path. But equally damaging will be all those who say, no, thank you. My family and I are going to go off and do something else. So it's huge. And it certainly plays not only in the military, but as Mark said, it will play. And by the way, the cuts of the State Department haven't been announced yet, but they're coming, I'm sure. Right? This is a huge fratricidal movement across the national security architecture.
So, Mark, obvious question. What about in the intel community?
Well, same thing. And, I have these conversations with, senior agency officers who are going to have to make those same decisions that Doug talked about. And everyone is going to have an individual decision to make. But can you actually represent a government that is doing some things like this? Do you stay on? As one person said, the quote was, I have 6,000 people who work for me, so it's my responsibility to them. Okay. I mean, that's always the some would say the excuse, but that's what some say. Okay, this is why you have to serve in an administration like this. And then others will say, look, if there's an illegal order that I am given, that is when I will speak up and then resign. There's no deep state. There's not going to be any kind of, resistance to it. You just have to resign if you can't kind of carry this through. But I think there is, also a notion within the intelligence community. It's the same thing with DoD. Certainly at the State Department, I was in Europe a couple of weeks ago, and I actually met with the embassy front office who were dealing with that same kind of email saying that we need the names of all of your probationary officers. But there's the way this is being done is not only cutting off the leadership of some of these organizations, but also the junior ranks. I mean, the next generation, Gen Z, who is supposed to, pick up that torch and hold it high in any agency as they go forward. They're the ones who also seem to be getting cut or on the firing line. And so they're wondering, is this the kind of career that I want to undertake? There's so many warning signs out there, and when Hegseth got rid of some of the JAGs, the lawyers for the various services, again, the same thing within the agency. Our legal staff is absolutely critical, especially when we do things such as kinetic operations. And they're always there to not necessarily say no, but say, okay, this is how you get to yes, but you've got to take this certain turn. If you have kind of yes men and women in these jobs, it's going to be a catastrophe. So I think that everyone in national security is going to have to really look themselves in the mirror. I would say, just on a personal level, this is for me. I would not be able to do it. And I would not be able to do it because my job at CIA was, CIA, as is forward facing. We serve in the director of operations. You're serving overseas. That means every day I have to go to the King of Jordan or the head of Jordanian General Intelligence and represent the United States government. I don't know how, maybe not in the Middle East, but particularly with European partners, you do this. I think back to, what does a CIA officer at Kyiv Station think right now? How do they face their Ukrainian counterparts? Same thing with Special Operations Forces in Europe, training Ukrainians. How does someone from 10th Group Special Forces go to their Ukrainian counterpart tomorrow after what happened today in the Oval and think it's okay? And so I think there is going to be a bit of a crisis within national security, just because there's this change is, as Rosa and Doug and David, as you said, is just absolutely dramatic. We're not neutral on this conflict. We're actually tilting towards Moscow. That's almost unthinkable in my old world.
Yeah, we're not just tilting towards Moscow, of course, on in terms of national security or foreign policy, Rosa. We're also tilting towards Moscow in terms of domestic policy, more towards authoritarianism. Putin has been as anti-woke as Trump has been anti-woke. Orban is kind of a model for the government that we're seeing set up here. This is part of a global right-wing movement that is seen as and was created as an alternative to the movement we were leading. So what does the average person do? Nothing? Throw up their hands? Get used to it? Start playing the Internationale every morning when their kids get up to go to school?
That will help, I'm sure. It's been, even though, as you know, David, I'm always predicting apocalypse, watching it happen, the speed and scale of the total dissolution of sort of federal government and the speed and scale of the compliance on the part of those who should and really do know better is nonetheless pretty stunning. We are absolutely beginning to resemble Putin's Russia. And we're seeing, the Washington Post's Jeff Bezos switching the entire opinion pages of the Washington Post will now be dedicated to free markets and personal liberty, which of course would be nice if they actually understood personal liberty to mean something like the Bill of Rights intended it to mean. But I think what it actually means is, Mr. Trump, I'm your man. We're seeing across the board, we're seeing just attacks on civil society, yanking the security clearances of lawyers at one of the country's major law firms because they worked with Special Prosecutor Jack Smith, is a direct shot across the bow to every lawyer in the United States. Combine that with the firing of the service JAGs and so forth. That is a direct shot across the bow that says to lawyers around the country, don't even think about representing somebody who is going to come against us. Don't even think about saying, hey, you're the client, you decide what to do, but I just need to tell you that the law is, that would be bad if you did that. Don't even think about it because we will come after you and we will make sure that your livelihood is under threat, et cetera, et cetera. We're seeing that across the board on multiple levels. I I think it's very hard to know what to do. But here is one thing, and I disagree with many of my friends about this. There's been a real debate about, okay, so if you are an ethical person who cares about democracy and checks and balances and the rule of law, is it better if you work for the federal government to stay and try to do good within it, or is it better to get out? And I've had, many people I respect say, well, we need everybody to stay. I think we're past that point. I'm not sure I was unsure I ever agreed with that, but I think we are now past that point. And indeed, I think the most dangerous thing, and this is something I've been worried about for a year, is, in some ways it's not the all at once authoritarianism. It's the little bit by little bit by little bit by little bit frog boiling problem. Although, as we know, frogs are smarter than humans, and frogs do get out of the water. Humans don't. We know this. We know this from every society that has slid into repression, atrocity, etc. Humans do not know enough to get out of the water as it's boiling them to death. The humans keep saying to themselves, well, maybe tomorrow things will be better, or maybe I'll find some like paltry little way in which I will make a difference. Gee, I might lose my job, so I better be compliant. And they think that they're going to protect themselves and somehow do good right up to the moment that they're fired anyway. And it becomes clear that far from doing good, they have actually just become one of the enablers of repression or even atrocity. And I think we're there. I recognizing that, easy for me to say, right? I haven't lost my job yet. I have tenure, which might protect me for at least another few weeks, right? Although clearly they're going after universities, they're going after tenure, they're going after academic freedom too. Easy for me to say to somebody whose family livelihood depends on their federal government employment, quit your job. But I think we are at the quit your job. Quit your job before you become complicit, and don't imagine that complicity will save you. Not only will your complicity not make the nation better, that you will not be able to change it from within, because this is not a group of people, unlike the first Trump administration. The first Trump administration, it is clear that people working on the inside did have some ability to slow things down, to say, even to Trump's political appointees, to say, that's maybe not such a hot idea, and, and get some traction. And, be able to use some common sense and make things a little bit less bad. It's quite clear that what is happening across the federal government, across the national security sector, across domestic policy making agencies, et cetera, is the opposite. That right now, if you are one of the people on the inside who says anything other than "sir, yes, sir," how high do you want me to jump? You will either be sidelined immediately, or you will simply be fired or laid off or put on quote unquote administrative leave or reassigned to the branch office in Juneau, Alaska, for the foreseeable future, which is forever. So you will not be able to stop things. You will not be able to slow things down. And even if you do say, "Sir, yes, sir," you will probably be fired anyway, sooner or later. So you are protecting nothing at this point by staying. You are not even protecting yourself. At this point, my advice to people working within the federal government is largely the one thing that might slow them down is if enough people just said, and print out all your critical personnel files first before you go, folks, because don't imagine they won't all vaporize the second you step out of the office. And in fact, by the way, there are resources online, a checklist for feds of what you want to do in case you are one of the many people who, we've already seen people on 15 minutes notice being fired. But leave. If everybody leaves, they can't function. And that is my final word. That barking noise you just heard is my final word on this.
Well, it sounds a lot like you. I'm going to ask Mark and Doug each a 30-second, 1-minute question, which, of course, because you guys have done this with us a long time, means that this is a question will require 2 hours to answer. But I'm going to make it 1-minute question. Because one of the things that came up today, Trump said over and over again, well, then you're going to be screwed if you don't go with us on this thing, on this extortionate, deal on minerals. Which, by the way, I do feel compelled to point out, there may not be any rare earth metals in Ukraine. We don't know. a lot of the minerals that are in Ukraine are actually in Russian-controlled Ukraine. They're not actually in the parts that we will have any access to. And the deal itself was completely bullshit. I mean, the whole deal was bullshit. But Doug, and then Mark, what strikes me is that Trump was saying, well, if you don't go along with this, you're going to lose. You're going to lose this war. You're going to be in a whole heap and a lot of trouble. But Zelensky, who's used to fighting Putin, with his entire army invading the country, is like, no, I'm not going to be intimidated. I'm going to keep going. And the Europeans are like, we're going to stand with you. Can Ukraine stand against Russia without the U.S.?
Yes, on a couple counts. So first of all, Ukrainian production of their own weapons spiked last year. The Ukrainians produced indigenously over 1 million drones. 1 million. The U.S. doesn't have anywhere close to that kind of production capacity. Based on the fact that they are supplanting some of the need for external aid with their own production, that's a big positive. I think if anybody would abide by this podcast, our European allies are finally realizing that their time is up. That whatever the relationship in the past, it's time for them to step up. And the Europeans actually, to this day, have already provided more aid to Ukraine than we have, right? So the Ukraine may lose us, but they still have the Europeans. And then finally, just a mark on quality. There are a lot of historical examples where the bigger force, the bigger army, loses to a smaller but higher quality army. The Ukrainians, exemplified by Zelensky in the Oval today, are fighting for their lives. And they're a higher quality, more coherent force, better trained, better motivated, better led than the Russians, who are essentially a low-grade occupation army. So I'll vote on the Ukrainian side, and I'll vote on quality beating quantity.
Same question, Mark. Last word.
Amen to that. We've written the kind of Ukrainian death notice many times. It does not come to fruition. I think while the lack of U.S. support is going to hurt them, I think Europe will step up. Doug is 1,000% right in terms of kind of this indigenous drone capacity being one of the incredible stories of the war. And I think Europe is going to rise to the occasion. I really do, because it is an existential crisis now for Europe that they have to deal with. I think Ukraine is going to be okay. The pain from today was just seeing the kind of the end of this kind of great American role in the world. And so to me, that is something that we saw. That's the demise, not the demise of Ukraine. The demise of America, again, is the bright, shining city on the hill. I think that's no longer.
Good place to end. Very poignant and accurate point. I saw Doug.
Always a little bit of a myth, obviously, in some ways, but Trump just put a stake through its heart.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. Well, it's been an extraordinary day. Not a day like anybody else here has ever seen. And the implications of the changes are far greater than any of us can fully understand right now. We'll come back. Hopefully we'll come back with exactly these people on a regular basis to talk about this. And I am so grateful that they could join us here at the last minute. Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Rosa. See you again soon. And I'm tempted to say have a good weekend, but I don't know how that's going to happen. Do your best. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Bye-bye.